Hello, and welcome back to Bumblebee, my scientist, historian, and curious people alike. I hope climate change doesn't make you anxious, because this video is going to touch down on the top 10 times nature dramatically altered the course of history. And there's no better start than the beginning itself. Number 10 is the spread of mankind. There is no greater decider of human history than climate change. No matter how many politicians try to buy their way out of that reality, and no matter how many companies try to deny their contribution to long-term effects on weather conditions. This is a simple reality, and one that will be the end of us, the same way it was our beginning. The first and only example in this countdown of sustained climate change is how it initiated the dispersal of the first Homo sapiens from Africa, our origin point, into other parts of the world. This information, learned from modern-day computer modeling and announced in September of 2016 by authors Axel Timmerman and Tobias Frederick, explores how strengthened monsoonial climates and wet conditions throughout the Arabian and Sinai peninsulas created clear migration paths laden with natural resources that opened and closed at different points in history. And what do you know? But those openings lined up perfectly with what evidence we have of human dispersal. The same dispersal that made it possible for us to survive and develop in different regions of the world and become who we are today. Other migration patterns, such as those into North Asia, also line up with the decreasing amounts of glaciers roughly 20,000 years ago. And wouldn't you know it, but the Bubonic Plague also originates with that African climate change. So it's number 9. As you may know, the Bubonic Plague came in 2 waves, the first being in the mid-6th century. It resulted with an estimated 25 million deaths, which accounted for about half of all the people living at the time in the Roman Empire and completely toppled the balances of power across the globe. Scientists point to a period of extreme droughts and colder temperatures in Africa during 530 as the Bubonic Plague's cause. So how this played out is by the lack of rain destroying the crops, it in turn depleted the population of small rodents that fed on those crops. The reduced number of these small rodents affected the animals higher up on the food chain, who now had nothing to eat and died. However, unlike the vegetation and the small animals, larger animals took longer to bounce back when the high levels of rain ended the drought. This lack of predators led to small rodents to then populate in high numbers and spread outwards, as humans had. These rodents inevitably found their way to merchant ships bound for Europe and elsewhere, carrying fleas with them. Those fleas, in turn, carried a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. When rodent flea hosts died, the tiny bugs hopped onto human hosts and infected millions. Number 8 will be about how invading Russia has always been a bad idea. First up on the roster of idiots who failed to invade Russia solely because they thought they could do it in the winter is Swedish King Charles XII, can't remember that number, in 1709, aka the year of the Great Frost, so already bad sign. He was the first great European invader to lead his men on the long march of rampantly stupid death and exhaustion, all the while Peter Tsar the Great executed the scorched earth strategy, consistently retreating to draw the Swedes further and further into the bush, dispersing cattle, hiding grain or burning crops, and destroying any resource the Swedes could use to survive on the way. Hint hint, they did not. The Swedish were defeated. 13,759 froze to death, and the greater part of Charles's army, some 19,000 men, are forced to surrender. Ah yes, and then there's Bonaparte, the famously short and angry man who decided to invade Russia in 1812 against the advice of literally everyone, so it's no surprise the whole invasion fell inwards. Napoleon's 600,000 men and more than 200,000 horses were no match for Russia's -20 to -4 degree winters. Once the horses died, there was nothing to transport the weapons and supplies. Without the supplies, well, starvation sets in. The worst part is when the defeat became inevitable, Napoleon abandoned the army and returned home on a sleigh to prevent a coup and left them to all freeze to death. Number 7, the Great Famine. So, cold summers lead to extremely cold winters, and when there's no snow, it only rains. Welcome to Europe between 1315 and 1317. Not the kind of destination vacay you were hoping for, I'm sure. It decimated the agriculture, leading to malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies when paired with poor weather. On top of that, disease began to spread, and well, with weakened immune systems and nothing in their gut, folks were dropping like flies. One can argue, Tereza, what about meat? Well, thank you for asking, but as stated in the second point of this video, when crops fail, small animals die, and big animals can't eat. So there was a lot of that. But also one other curious factor, because destroyed crops, the price of salt skyrocketed. Salt was the only way to cure meat at the time, and the brine was incapable of evaporating, so it could be used repetitively. Folks in the 13th century country weren't brimming with ideas on other ways to preserve or even prepare meat, so salt became a luxury even for the rich, as did bread. Agriculture did not bounce back in the region for well over a decade, and consequently millions died in the years that followed from starvation, rampant disease, madness killings, even some desperate people eating. Pretty much all of this chaos can be accredited to the ash blown out of Mount Tarawera in New Zealand in 1315, which wreaked havoc on the environment for 5 years. Next up is Galveston's Hurricane, number 6. Figured I'd throw in a little bit of an unexpected event, but ultimately, even with the lower death toll than others on this list, Galveston's Hurricane reshaped Texan history. Galveston, Texas is on the low-lying barrier island of the coast, which leaves it vulnerable to storms, such as the one in the year 1900. On September 8th, the day it struck, Galveston was the richest city in all of Texas and the 3rd richest city in all of America. For 19 days, it ripped through the city. When it was over, the city was pretty much gone and the economy was completely washed away. Weather Bureau forecasters thought the hurricane was heading for the Atlantic coast, so when they did realize it was heading their way on September 5th, they failed to estimate the full extent of the deadly high tide generated. The Weather Bureau had suggested that people should move to higher ground, but there was little higher ground on the island, so residents and vacationers alike disregarded the warnings and simply prepared for a bad storm. By the time it hit Galveston, the destruction of the bridges to the mainland prevented the islanders' escape and marooned everyone. Weather Service instruments were literally blown away, but before they were, an estimated 135 mile-per-hour winds classified the hurricane as the equivalent of a Category 4 storm. Water swept away buildings as far as 6 blocks inland and splintered the rest of the town. Between 8,000 and 11,000 people died, and at least 10,000 of the city's nearly 38,000 residents were left homeless. Rescuers were so overwhelmed they dumped bodies into the Gulf of Mexico, and when they washed back, they built funeral pyres that survivors said burned for days and nights. Due to the loss of life and the property damages, estimated at over $700 million in today's currency, the Galveston Hurricane of 1900 remains the deadliest natural disaster in America's history. Number 5 is about, in the words of Elizabeth I, how God blew and they were scattered. It's the Spanish Armada. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 has been called one of the most decisive battles in Western civilization. King Philip II of Spain sent his Spanish Armada to invade England as the world's worst wedding gift to his brand new sis-in-law, Elizabeth I. The goal was to return the nation from a Protestant land back into a Catholic one, because I guess things like that matter. Things were going just fine until the Armada made it to Calais, where each boat dropped its anchor and waited to join forces with the Spanish army there. But while the fleet was anchored, the English launched a surprise mission on the Sitting Duck, sending 8 burning ships into the crowded harbor, causing the Armada to try and lift anchor before they reached them. But Mother Nature decided to jump in on it too, and Homegirl brought the folding chair. So, high winds and waves from the Atlantic storm pushed the flaming ships in a hardcore beeline right towards the Armada, and their cascading flames reach farther than the ship themselves do. The Spaniards, in a panic, are left with no choice but to turn and hightail it out of there and return to Spain. It was too late for most of the Armada though. Less than half of the 130-ship fleet returned home and 20,000 troops perished. Elizabeth attributed the storm to divine intervention, inscribing the commemorative medals with the phrase "God blew and they were scattered." Number 4 is the great chief who fought for the peoples. It's Tecumseh. He was the Shawnee war chief, field commander, and leader born around 1768 in Ohio. Tecumseh organized the Pan-Indian Federation, intending to bring indigenous communities throughout the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley together in preserving their cultures and rights against encroaching settlers. Tecumseh saw the take attitude of the colonizers, who didn't recognize land could truly belong to nobody but the land itself. His ideology is if they were never to leave the land alone, they have to have a border at which to stop. So Tecumseh fought tirelessly for his people, traveling as far south as the Gulf of Mexico and north into Canada to promote his idea. His territory of 100,000 people was up against 7 million settlers in the United States, but Tecumseh's work nevertheless had the colonizers worried. He fought with the British in the War of 1812 against the United States, successfully taking over Detroit and overrunning enemy forts. But it's what happened to Tecumseh during the 6-day battle at Moravian Town that changed history. Now known as the Battle of Thames, Tecumseh and 600 indigenous soldiers hide in some swamps as the intense fog rolls in. More fighting ensued in the low visibility, but Tecumseh was never seen again. He was presumably or captured, potentially even slid into a bog opening or drowned in mud. But the dense fog covered up what happened, and it contributed to the United States' consolidation of control over native lands throughout the Midwest and Northwest, something that would have never occurred had Tecumseh not vanished. Yeehaw, and into the Dust Bowl we go for number 3. The Great Depression in 1929 ripped America a new one, as we all know. Starvation, disease, poverty. Meanwhile, farmers in the southern plains continued to grow crops and roll in the dough. Not like dough, I mean like money dough. So I can see how that can be misconstrued. And now I've said dough too many times. Anyway, so in 1931, the rain stopped and those same workers went from being the most prosperous people in the nation to the worst off there had yet to be. Talk about the last laugh, eh? So dust storms rolled through the plains, picking up topsoil and obliterating the area's agriculture. Seedlings couldn't take root, and when they did, the dry air just decimated what little they grew. This is an excellent example as to the consequences of biodynamic farming principles going unfollowed. In the Great Plains, grasses are essential for trapping moisture and keeping soil from eroding or cracking. Their deep root systems preserve water tables, help with pet correlation and habitat. But settlers were employing deep plowing and dryland farming methods that lent themselves to wind erosion, which was exacerbated by drought. With dead soil being tossed up in the air as dust, it blotted out the daylight and caused respiratory distress for thousands. Many families faced extreme poverty and famine and were forced to leave their farms for the city, only to discover the Great Depression had destroyed any economy prospects there too. Number 2 is so gross your skin may crawl. It's the Locust Plagues. Nothing says horrifying nightmare more than a wall of bugs flying at you so densely they're mistakable as a cloud. And it just so happened that the timing of the Easterners' migration into the Great Plains coincided with the devastating swarms of locusts. The insects mainly stayed in the Rocky Mountains until a jet stream facilitated movements to the plains, where heat helped them breed. So not only is it a horde of bugs, but it's a horde of bugs looking for hot young singles near you. The hungry scavengers devoured everything in their path to fuel up for the love-making sessions. This could be crops, but also fences, blankets, houses, roofs, hell, even the clothes off your literal body. When the food was gone, the swarms moved on in a flying cloud to the next potential snack bar. These horrifying insects caused an estimated 200 million in crop damage in Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, and more. In Minnesota, where author Laura Ingalls Wilder witnessed the plague, locusts destroyed more than 13 million bushels of wheat and 7 million bushels of oats. The rasping whirring of their wings filled the whole air, wrote Wilder, and they hit the ground and house with the noise of a hailstorm. The largest swarm was recorded in 1874, and shudder, it covered 198,000 square miles. A report that year showed that only 1 family in 10 had enough food for the winter as a result. The government relaxed Homestead Act residency rules so settlers could seek temporary work elsewhere. By 1875, Uncle Sam spent $30,000 on seeds for farmers. Less than 30 years later, locusts mysteriously died out, and no one's upset about it. And last, never the least, it's number 1, the Mini Ice Age, which caused all kinds of drama, such as the Salem witch trials. Something must have been in the water back in those days, because there's a lot of conclusion jumps ancient folks made that don't really line up. But hey, it was their world, and they insisted there were witches in it, ones that could control the weather. The famous Salem witch trials between 1692 and 1693, and while the cause of it, of course, was witches, the reality for the hysteria was a mishmash of everything from socioeconomic issues to the pervasive cold weather, which does overlap with periods of witch hunts throughout history. The Little Ice Age theory laid out in 2004 by graduate student at Harvard contends that people thought witches could control the weather and thus were intentionally destroying the food of communities by doing so, because I guess in their world witches don't eat. The reason for this blame game was because someone needed to be at fault and public stress. Women were easy to blame, and witchcraft was impossible to prove, let alone disprove. It was an easy solve. Several diaries and even church sermons from the times suggest that the bad weather helped to inspire these allegations. The same miniature ice age that contributed to the accusations of witchcraft in Salem and throughout Europe also contributed to rising tensions in France, as they faced the same crop failures as their American counterparts. However, in France, people were already strapped by taxes, which had been raised to support the American Revolution against the British Empire. The economic downturn and low food supply came to a head in 1788 when very heavy rains and hailstorms destroyed that year's grain harvest and decimated crops. The upheaval led straight to the storming of the Bastille, Paris's armory and political prison that served as a symbol of monarchy's corruption, in 1789, aka the French Revolution. Thank you once again for tuning in, and I sure hope you enjoyed. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more from us, and until next time, drop a comment down below on which one of these in the countdown you truly thought was the worst.